The coffee smell was the only lively thing in Jerry's small kitchen that late May afternoon in Rock Springs, Wyoming, where the breeze came through a cracked window and pushed at a faded curtain. He moved carefully, the way a man learns to move after decades of fixing small problems no one else will fix, rinsing an old mug and setting it to dry beside a chipped plate. On the other side of the thin wall, Eleanor Henderson's voice rose like the squeak of a stubborn hinge. "Your sprinklers are drowning my begonias again, Jerry." He wiped his hands on a dish towel and stepped to the sink to look through the window at the narrow strip of shared lawn, thinking about the loose joint in the timer he had meant to reseal. The phone rang, a landline because he never saw a reason to change what worked, and he let it go once, twice, 3 times, as Eleanor added something about property values and inconsiderate tenants. On the 5th ring, he crossed the linoleum and lifted the receiver. Jerry Flores speaking. The woman's voice carried a professional steadiness that made the kitchen feel smaller. "Mr. Flores, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Welsh and Associates in Cheyenne. I am calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores." He stood still, the dish towel cooling in his hands. The full name drew a road back through years he avoided driving. "What about her?" he asked, and his voice sounded to him like a voice from the next room. "I am very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Flores passed away on Tuesday evening. The funeral is scheduled for Friday at 2 o'clock at Riverside Memorial Chapel. There will be a reading of the will afterward, and you are named as a beneficiary." The word beneficiary fell into the quiet between the ticking wall clock and Eleanor's muffled complaints. He pulled a chair from the table and sat, the seat creaking the way it always had, and looked at the faint rings from old coffee mugs that no amount of scrubbing could lift. "Beneficiary," he repeated, not to her but to the air, as if the kitchen itself might explain. Janet continued with calm patience, born of hard days. "The reading is at 4:30 in our downtown office. Riverside Memorial Chapel is on Grand Avenue. We would appreciate your presence." He pictured the chapel on the hill with its stained glass windows and polished pews, the kind of room where people spoke softly and wore their good suits. He owned one good suit. He had pressed it last month for a neighbor's memorial, a simple service with a potluck afterward and coffee in styrofoam cups. He cleared his throat. "I will be there," he said, and heard the relief in Janet's tone as she thanked him and confirmed the details. When he hung up, the apartment gave back the small, ordinary sounds that mean a life is still going. The refrigerator hum, the soft rattle of a vent, the distant drip that had started again in the bathroom even though he had fixed it twice. He stood and cleaned without thinking, lifting the mug he had washed, setting it further from the edge as if that would steady something larger. He pulled open the closet and found the garment bag where the suit waited, a neat promise in dark wool, then zipped it closed and leaned it back against the wall. The light outside shifted, that late-day brightness that makes dust motes look like tiny travelers passing through. He told himself to write the time and place on a notepad, then realized he had already written Grand Avenue on the margin of the grocery list near milk and coffee filters. He thought about Brianna as she had been long before the offices and the contracts and the evenings full of names he could not remember. He thought about the diner where she had argued for fairness with her head high and her voice clear, about the September wedding when the sky was so blue it looked like it might ring if someone struck it with a spoon. He thought about the house on Maple Street where he had learned the sounds of a sleeping child, tiny breaths that changed everything about what mattered. He rinsed the dish towel and wrung it out, then hung it over the oven handle. Eleanor's voice softened next door, a door closed, footsteps moving away, the neighborhood returning to its regular rhythm. He stepped out to the walkway and checked the sprinkler head by the border of begonias, turned the valve gently, and wiped a bit of mud on his jeans. He reminded himself to bring over a small bunch of flowers for Eleanor in the morning, not because he was at fault, but because kindness keeps a street livable. Back inside, he set a second chair by the table for the suit and laid out a clean white shirt, the one with the collar that still sat straight. He called no one. There was no one to call who would not turn a simple fact into a story with edges. He brewed fresh coffee without really wanting it, and poured half a cup anyway, then stood by the window and watched a pair of teenagers ride by on bikes too small for their long legs. He tried to picture the chapel again, then the lawyer's office with its certificates on the wall and a desk that would reflect the afternoon light. He tried to imagine why his name belonged in any of it, after all these years, after all the failed attempts to keep a marriage from becoming a calendar of missed chances. He folded the grocery list into quarters, tore off the corner with the address, and slid it into his wallet behind his driver's license. He told himself he would arrive early, sit in the back, keep his hands folded and his voice quiet, and leave before anyone needed to decide what to say to him. He washed the cup and turned it upside down on the rack, then turned it right side up again because habits have their own reasons. He opened the refrigerator, stared at a carton of eggs, closed it, and reached instead for the small tin where he kept loose change for laundry. There was enough for 2 loads, which made him feel prepared for something he could control. Evening light bent across the table and reached toward the phone, and the apartment settled. A modest ship in a calm harbor. Jerry sits in his kitchen staring at the phone, wondering why Brianna would have remembered him at all. The smell of strong coffee and apple pie pulls Jerry back nearly 4 decades to the night he first saw Brianna. Snow pushed against the diner windows in slow waves, and the neon sign hummed like a patient engine, blue and red light washing the chrome edges of the counter. He was younger then, a man who kept his head down and his promises kept, a man who fixed things that broke and left the world a little tidier than he found it. The cook slid a plate across to him, the apple pie still warm, a scoop of vanilla melting into a river along the crust. He had cut the first bite when a woman in a red wool coat lifted her chin at the far end of the counter and told the manager in a steady voice that a hiring policy that dismissed women for weekend shifts was not only wrong, but foolish. Her words were even and clear without heat, and they carried to every booth as if the tiled floor needed to hear them too. The manager replied with the weary shrug of a man who believed the way things had always been was the way things should be. She laid a business card by the register and told him that when he wanted to hire for talent rather than habit, he could call. Jerry felt the room tilt toward her, not in a showy way, but like a compass needle finding north. He was not the sort who jumped into arguments, but he stared at that red coat and understood that a person who stood up for others made a room better just by standing. He left a good tip beside the pie he did not finish, and as he stepped into the bright cold, he watched her check her mirrors twice before easing a blue Honda into the street, careful but sure. He kept the business card in his wallet for 3 days, reading the number like a line from a map, and then he called. Her voice was brisk and musical. She remembered his face without sounding impressed, which made him braver. When he asked if she would have dinner with him at Romano's on 3rd Street on Saturday evening, she said yes in a tone that made the word feel like a small green light turning steady. He cleaned his one sport coat and polished his shoes at the kitchen table with a rag that had once been a t-shirt. At Romano's, candles glowed in squat red glasses, and servers moved with the careful speed of people who knew that meals were small ceremonies. She wore a black dress beneath that same red coat, and when she laughed at his story about a leaky faucet that became a waterfall, the sound landed softly in his chest. They talked about library cards and road trips they had not taken yet, about her childhood near the coast and his years at the power plant, where the hum of turbines became a second heartbeat. She asked precise questions and listened like a person who could make space for answers. He told her he valued people who kept their word. She said she did too. After dinner, they walked to the corner and stood beneath a streetlight that painted the fresh snow gold. He did not kiss her. He wished her a good night in a voice that tried not to rush. He went home and wrote her name on a slip of paper he would later keep in a kitchen drawer with rubber bands and spare keys. The dates that followed found their rhythm in easy ways. They sat in a booth at Murphy's Diner on cold mornings and shared the Sunday paper, passing sections without asking, the way people do when care has turned into trust. He learned that she woke early without complaint and preferred the first cup of coffee in a real mug, not paper. She learned that he could fix almost anything with patience and the right tool, and that he believed kindness was a tool. They hiked the short trail out to the overlook where the wind taught you to lean. They bought a used bookshelf and carried it 3 flights up while laughing at how they should have measured twice and lifted once. She picked wildflowers from the edge of a field in September, and he tucked a small white bloom behind her ear with hands that tried to be gentle and were. The talk about work stayed easy then. She was already advising small businesses, and she spoke about invoices and clients as if she were stacking small bricks. He pictured her building something that would last and felt only pride, not the worry that would come later when the bricks became walls. At Murphy's one evening, 6 months to the day after that first look across the counter, he slid a ring box across the formica because he believed that the places where promises start are sometimes the very best places to renew them. She put her palm flat on the box without opening it and looked at him the way someone looks at a map and sees the route home. She said yes before the lid clicked. Their wedding took place under a sky so clear it felt like a blessing. She wore her grandmother's dress that had been altered with care, and he held his breath when the vows reached the word forever because he meant it. They ate cake on small plates with real forks, and he danced like a man surprised that joy had a simple step. Dustin arrived 2 years later, red-faced and loud at first, and then steady as a sunrise in the habits of family life. Jerry learned how to warm a bottle without boiling it and how to sleep in short chapters. He stood in the nursery doorway in the soft light of a night lamp and felt something open inside him that had no name except purpose. In those early years, before the house on Hillrest and the conferences in hotels with carpets so thick they swallowed your steps, love looked like grocery lists and oil changes and holding a baby while dinner cooled. When the consulting business began to grow, he watched her calendar fill and told himself that seasons change and families bend. He fixed the hinges and paid the electric bill on time and wiped little handprints from the refrigerator door without mentioning it. He noticed the new clients, the fresh confidence, the pride that made her eyes brighter when she talked about a plan that worked. He did not mind. He clapped the loudest. On winter mornings, he scraped the windshield of her car so she could leave 5 minutes sooner. On spring evenings, he grilled chicken on the small back porch and waved to the neighbors over the fence. When Dustin turned 7, Brianna placed a real computer on the desk where crayons had once lived, and Jerry stood in the doorway and tried to understand this new future taking shape. He suggested fishing on Saturday to balance the screen time, and she smiled without warmth and said the world had other plans. He stored the fishing poles in the garage and promised himself he would try again next month. Years later, he would sit in the quiet of his small apartment and replay the early scenes, not to change them, but to remember that tenderness was not a mistake. He would remind himself that the beginning had been honest, that the best parts were not illusions, but bricks in a foundation that could still support him. Memory had a way of choosing what to light, and that night at the diner, it lit a red coat, a clean voice, and a young man who understood he had just met the person who would teach him how to be brave in ordinary ways. As Jerry remembers sliding the ring across the counter, his smile fades. The memory of their love is overshadowed by how it ended. Success came quickly for Brianna, and with it, a world Jerry no longer recognized. The first signs were small and easy to ignore. A new client who paid on time every month. A second car that started in any weather. An upgraded refrigerator that made ice at the door and hummed like a polite guest. Jerry told himself that this was progress, and that progress could sit beside a simple life if everyone made room. He kept the Maple Street kitchen shining, kept the tools in the hall closet arranged by size, and learned to make a pasta sauce Dustin liked on school nights when Brianna worked late. He still brought her coffee in a real mug in the morning, set on a folded dish towel so it would not leave a ring, and she smiled and said thank you while checking her calendar. The consulting firm grew like a strong vine against a sunny wall. There were contracts with companies Jerry had only read about in the paper. There were flights to Denver and Salt Lake City and beyond. There were dinners where the talk turned to markets and mergers and exit strategies. Jerry bought a new shirt for those evenings and wore his good watch. He tried to follow the conversation, nodding at the right moments, offering brief comments about steady work and reliable service that sounded small, beside talks of scaling and leverage. He learned the names of wine regions, the way he had once learned the names of wrench sizes. When people asked what he did, Brianna answered for him, with a tone that was polite and thin. He works at the power plant. He keeps the lights on. He heard no pride there, only a tidy label placed where it would not draw attention. Dustin grew up inside that new world, as if it had always been his. At 7, he sat in front of a real computer that cost more than Jerry's first car, and moved the mouse with careful certainty. At 10, he walked into restaurants where hosts greeted him like a small regular and asked if he would like the usual. At 12, he glanced at a wine list and copied the rhythm of adult talk about tannins without understanding it, but enjoying the music of belonging. Jerry tried to hold ground that felt good underfoot. He suggested fishing on Saturday, teaching him to cast where the current slows, turning a quiet morning into a lesson about patience. Dustin smiled without looking up and said there was a youth robotics meet he could not miss. Jerry put the tackle box back on the shelf and told himself that new interests were not enemies of old values, even if they did not sit at the same table. The house on Hillrest Avenue came after a contract that Brianna said changed the firm's future. It had a view of the low mountains and a kitchen island as wide as the table where Dustin used to color. The crystal chandelier over the new dining table insisted on coasters. The quiet at night felt different, insulated, the way a winter coat can keep a man warm and still make him miss the bite of honest wind. There were parties where the living room held more strangers than Jerry had known in a year. He stood by the window with a plate and answered polite questions that drifted toward other conversations. In those rooms, he understood that language can be a ladder, and that his words belonged to the first few rungs. He did not resent it. He simply knew where his feet stood. Before Dustin's 15th birthday, the gap between what the family had and what it held dear split in two clean lines. Brianna planned an event that looked like an industry mixer with a cake. Caterers walked through the kitchen like a well-trained team. A hired entertainer tested the sound system. Jerry stood at the edge of the dining room and tried to find the boy version of the young man this party seemed to expect. He asked for a backyard barbecue and a handful of school friends. Brianna straightened a centerpiece and said that Dustin needed connections and that the world was not waiting for anyone who did not push forward. Jerry thought about a birthday when he was 15, a paper crown from a burger place and a cake baked in a small pan with a crack in the middle that had been covered with frosting and laughter. The party impressed the adults. The food was fine and the speeches were tidy. Dustin worked the room with a confidence that looked like talent and sounded like rehearsal. Jerry caught him alone by the sliding door once, staring out at the pool lights. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, and Dustin smoothed his face like a hand had wiped across a mirror. "Of course. Why would I not be?" Jerry nodded and stepped away, because there are moments a father respects even when he hates them, moments when a boy is deciding what words will be allowed. Later that night, when the kitchen was clean and the last guest had left, the argument that had been waiting finally climbed the stairs. Jerry asked again for simpler moments, for family dinners without phones, for a Saturday without an agenda. Brianna said the business needed her, and that Dustin's future needed the business. The words they used were careful, but the meanings were hard. When people say priority, they often mean trade. They traded sleep for growth, weekends for flights, a shared table for separate calendars. The missed milestones came like slow rain. Dustin's game that no one filmed because meetings ran long. A teacher's note about a school presentation that needed a parent in the audience. A vacation that was booked and then canceled so cleanly that the suitcase went back to the closet with the tag still attached. Jerry did not slam doors. He did not deliver speeches that left rooms quiet for the wrong reasons. He did something plainer. He kept showing up. He sat through parent nights even if he sat alone. He kept the old Maple Street house when they said they were done, because an anchor does not argue with the tide. He made sure Dustin had clean clothes and a packed lunch when schedules were tangled. He read a few business books from the library, partly to understand Brianna's world and partly to test himself. He learned enough to know that numbers can tell the truth and hide it at the same time, and that character still matters when a contract does not. The end of the marriage did not arrive with a storm. It arrived with a sentence that both of them felt before either of them said it. We are not a family. We are a business arrangement that does not work. Brianna said it in a low voice at midnight in a kitchen that had never been messy. Jerry sat down because standing made the room tilt. He said he would not fight her in court for things he did not need. He kept Maple Street and a modest cushion that looked smaller when set beside her empire. Dustin, nearly grown, chose the altitude of Hillrest. Jerry did not blame him. A young man often chooses the higher view. After the papers were signed, life counted itself differently. The calendar no longer carried two sets of plans. Jerry learned the quiet of a small place with reliable heat and a roof that needed a patch every spring. He worked his shifts, nodded to neighbors, and volunteered one evening a week at the community center, where he checked the boiler and fixed lamps, and sometimes helped an older couple fill out an online form that refused to be simple. When Dustin called, their talks were polite and short. When he visited, which was not often, he wore a suit that fit like he lived inside it, and Jerry poured coffee and kept his questions soft. He asked about work and said he was proud, and Dustin nodded like pride was a thing you put on a shelf between awards. Years turned in their steady way. On certain mornings, Jerry woke before dawn and drove to the lake with a thermos and a sandwich, not to fish, but to sit and let his mind lay out the pieces of a life that had not gone the way he once imagined and was still worth living. He thought about the good lessons he could leave even if he never got a chance to say them out loud. Work steady, keep your word. When you can, fix what is in front of you. When you cannot, do not break it more. He sent Dustin cards on birthdays and holidays with short notes that did not ask for anything. Dustin sometimes replied with a text that sounded like a meeting ended early. Then the call came, and Friday arrived with a cool wind and the kind of sky that keeps its feelings to itself. Jerry pressed his suit the way he had done for neighbors and small services. He folded a white handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. He drove through streets that told the whole story of Rock Springs in a 20-minute loop, from old blocks with porches to new homes with perfect lawns. He parked a car that had seen better years between cars that announced what their owners could afford. He walked toward the chapel with its stained glass and quiet steps and paused for a breath that had nothing to do with the climb. 15 years later, Jerry stands outside Riverside Memorial Chapel, ready to face the son who has not spoken to him in years. The chapel glowed with stained glass light, while whispers followed Jerry to the back pew, as if the past had arrived to sit beside him. The air carried the mixed scents of cut lilies and old wood polish, and the soft shuffle of dress shoes on tiles sounded like a tide pulling in and out. He eased into a seat near the aisle and folded his hands, the way a man does when he wants to be present without taking space. Faces turned, then turned away. He caught the glance of a woman in a dark suit nudging her companion as if to say, "There he is." He let the moment pass over him like weather. He looked toward the front where a framed photo of Brianna stood on an easel, her smile captured in a calm that had been rare in real life. The organist tested a few gentle chords. The funeral director moved with practiced quiet, touching the end of a pew here, straightening a program there, keeping the service on its rails. Jerry focused on breath and posture. He reminded himself he had come to honor a promise made under a September sky, even if time had thinned that promise into something the world no longer recognized. He did not see Dustin until the sound of his name cut through the low murmur the way a sharp edge cuts cloth. Dad. The word landed not as welcome but as challenge. Dustin came down the aisle with the quick, contained stride of a man used to steering rooms. His suit fit neat across the shoulders. His jaw set in a way that looked like Brianna at the end of a long day. He stopped near Jerry's pew and asked in a voice meant for everyone, "Why are you here?" Jerry rose because sitting felt like hiding, and he said he had come to pay his respects and would sit quietly and leave when the service ended. The conversation gathered listeners like a magnet gathers filings. A few heads lifted. The rustle of programs paused. Someone cleared a throat somewhere in the middle rows. Dustin said divorce meant the word family no longer applied, and that his mother would not have wanted the past to intrude on her last day. Jerry kept his voice level. He He said that once two people make vows, something real exists, even if the form of it does not last, and sometimes a man shows up simply to keep faith with what was true. For a beat there was only the breath of the room. Then the funeral director stepped near the lectern and announced they would begin in 5 minutes. Dustin held Jerry's gaze a moment longer, then moved to the front pew where the family sat, shoulders squared, head held high. A few people offered him quick, careful squeezes on the shoulder as he passed. Jerry sat again and smoothed the crease of his trousers with his palm. He looked up at the windows where blue and red and gold fell across the pew backs and thought about how light could make even worn wood look new for a little while. The service opened with a hymn that half the room hummed instead of sang. The eulogy painted Brianna as a builder, a leader, a woman who believed in hard choices and tenacious follow-through. A former client spoke about a contract that saved jobs and praised her talent for turning chaos into order. Jerry listened without resentment. He knew that version of her, the one whose eyes lit with a plan. He also knew the cost of that kind of light and the way it could bleach the color out of a kitchen table. When the minister asked for a moment of silence, Jerry bowed his head and allowed memory to arrive without sorting it. The Saturday mornings that smelled like pancakes and floor cleaner. The late nights when the glow of a laptop made the living room feel like an airport. The day Dustin took his first steps while holding the edge of the couch, turning to be sure someone was looking. At the end, mourners filed forward with the slow choreography of services everywhere. There were the usual soft phrases, sorry for your loss and thinking of you, and the practiced pauses that hold back tears and keep mascara where it belongs. Jerry waited until the line thinned, then stood to slip out by the side aisle. He had made it this far without breaking the surface of the day. He had been a shadow that kept to cool corners. He had almost reached the door when a man in a well-cut suit stepped into his path with the polite confidence of someone who belongs in every room he enters. "Mr. Flores," he said, offering a hand and a name. "Dan Morrison. Thank you for being here. If you have a moment, I would like to speak with you and with Dustin together." Jerry nodded. He looked past Dan toward the front where Dustin was accepting handshakes and brief embraces as if they were obligations to be met with good form. The chapel had begun to relax the way a room does when the main event is over. People were gathering coats and handbags. Someone laughed softly at a memory near the middle. The organist closed the lid over the keys. Jerry felt the familiar pull to vanish, to step out to the parking lot and let the rest of the day run without him. But Dan's voice carried no invitation to opt out. It carried the quiet force of a calendar note made by someone who never misses appointments. Dustin arrived with a look that tried for patience and landed on irritation. He asked if the business part could wait until tomorrow. Dan said the reading had been scheduled for this afternoon and that it should proceed as planned. Dustin thanked another mourner with a practiced smile that did not reach his eyes, and then turned back to Dan and asked whether Jerry's presence was necessary. Dan answered in the same even tone he had used with Jerry. He said Brianna had named both of them and that both were required at the reading. Jerry felt something move under that sentence, the way ground can shift slightly before a train passes. They walked out together, the three of them, into the clear brightness of late day. The air tasted like rain that had changed its mind. Down the hill, the town lay in ordinary order, traffic at the light on the corner of Grand, and a few kids cutting across the lawn against posted rules. The chapel doors closed behind them with a thud that did not echo. Dustin kept half a step ahead, his shoes clicking on the stone. Jerry let the pace be what it was. He watched the angle of Dustin's shoulders and recognized his own posture from another life, the way a person carries himself when he is doing something hard and refuses to show the weight. On the sidewalk outside, a couple intercepted Dustin to say they had loved working with his mother and that she had once changed their fortunes with a single piece of advice. Dustin nodded and thanked them, then excused himself with crisp politeness. Jerry waited until the couple had moved on, then said a quiet thank you of his own to the universe for letting him witness the better parts of his son, the parts that were still teachable if anyone ever found the right door. They set off down the block toward the old Victorian that housed Dan's firm, a place that managed to look both prosperous and rooted. Dan made light conversation about the turnout and the weather, not prying, not filling the air more than needed. The town's short downtown rose around them with its brick fronts and second-story windows that watched like old neighbors. Jerry noted a diner sign flickering on against the late afternoon, the promise of coffee and a plate if he needed it later. He touched the folded handkerchief in his pocket, not to use it, but to know it was there. They reached the gate, and Dan paused to be sure both men understood that the next part of the day would be formal and final. Dustin exhaled through his nose, set his jaw, and nodded. Jerry said he would sit quietly and listen. He meant it. He had not come to claim anything. He had come because endings deserved witnesses who knew the beginning. Dan says both of them are specifically required for the reading, and his tone makes it clear something significant is coming. In a wood-paneled office above Main Street, the law spoke in a calm voice, while two lives tilted on their axes. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Afternoon light angled through tall windows and landed on a desk polished to a slow shine. Certificates lined the walls like framed promises. An antique clock ticked with steady patience. Jerry sat in the chair a little off-center, the one that fit a man who did not expect to be the point of the day. Dustin took the seat closest to the desk, shoulders square, jaw steady. Dan Morrison opened a blue-backed folder and read in the tone of a person who knows that words have work to do. He began with the formalities. The will had been executed the previous spring, witnessed and affirmed for sound mind. No pressure from anyone, no strings that had not been written down. He turned a page. He said the first bequest by name. To her son, Dustin, the family home on Hillrest Avenue, with furnishings and art inside its walls. In addition, a cash bequest of $500,000 to be transferred within a reasonable period after probate. Dustin did not move, but his eyes changed, the small inward shift of a man counting and finding the sum respectable, but not complete. He asked about the company, about the portfolio, about what came next. Dan lifted a hand in a quiet request for patience and returned to the page. There are conditions attached to the bequest to Dustin, he said. Continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for no fewer than 2 years following the date of the will, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. The word conditions entered the room like a draft under a heavy door. Dustin leaned forward. Conditions, he said, as if the syllables did not suit the occasion. He asked who would sell the company. He said his mother would never contemplate that. Dan did not debate what a person would or would not contemplate. He simply turned the page. Then he read the next provision, and the air in the room changed. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million from my primary investment accounts and securities, together with controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions and its subsidiary entities, comprising 65% of all corporate shares, an appointment as chair of the board of directors. Jerry heard the words and did not feel them land. The number sounded like a story from another life told in a voice that was not meant for him. The chair made a small sound as he sat back. He said there must be an error, not loud, more like a thought that escaped. Dan met his eyes and said there was no error. The documents had been reviewed and affirmed. The instructions were explicit. The antique clock ticked once, then once again, louder only because the room had fallen still. Dustin stood so fast that his chair rolled into the wall and came back a few inches like a scolded dog. He said this was impossible. He demanded to know who had approached his mother, who had planted the idea, who had taken advantage when she was weak. Dan's voice did not rise or harden. He said the testator had undergone a mental competency evaluation at the time of execution, conducted by an independent specialist. He said she was in excellent command of her decisions and that safeguards had been put in place precisely to prevent the accusations now being made. Jerry tried to breathe evenly. He looked at the window frame and counted the small imperfections in the wood to give his mind a place to rest. He could hear Dustin's anger, the kind that comes from fear and loss, and he could hear underneath it the tremor of a man who had built his future on an assumption now removed. He said to his son in a quiet voice that he had not sought this, and had not spoken with Brianna in many years. Dustin called that a convenient story. He said people do not leave empires to a man who wanted a smaller life. He said character does not pay payroll. Dan lifted a second envelope from the folder, the kind of envelope that holds fewer pages than its weight suggests. He said Brianna had left a personal message to be read aloud to both men after the bequests were announced. He did not ask for permission. He slid a page free, held it at an angle to the window, and began in the even cadence he used for testimony and tender things alike. She spoke first to Jerry. She said she never stopped loving him, not during arguments, not after lawyers, not during the quiet years when pride felt easier than humility. She said he had tried to save what mattered, and that she had chosen another road. She said he deserved what she was leaving because he would never use it to wound or to prove. She said he would use it to fix what could be fixed and to leave the world a little kinder. She asked him to accept the responsibility with the same steady hands he brought to every small task that once kept a home running. She spoke to Dustin with care. She said he was brilliant and capable, and that he had lived beneath a canopy of her making long enough to forget that weather exists. She said wealth is a tool that requires a grip learned through work and perspective, not hunger for position. She said he had received enough to live, to learn, and to build without the gravity of an empire pressing a shape into him that was not his. She asked him to forgive his father for being human and imperfect, and to forgive her for teaching him that achievement can replace love. She reminded him that people must come before profit if a life is to remain a life and not a performance. As Dan read, the office changed tempo. The clock did not slow, but the men who listened did. Jerry's shoulders settled the way earth settles after rain. He felt seen in a place where he least expected it. He felt the old ache of love and the new ache of being trusted with something large. He did not feel triumphant. He felt responsible. Dustin's posture shifted in small jerks, as if he were seated on a train that had taken a curve too fast. Anger still lived in the set of his mouth, but another expression visited and left. A thin line of hurt that a man hides because he does not know where to put it. Dan reached the practical parts. She had written that the current management team was capable and that Jerry should listen to those who had earned their roles. She suggested that community impact and employee well-being were not sentimental extras, but metrics that mattered. She encouraged Dustin to take time away from the building that carried their name and to try work that tested what he valued when no one was watching. She hoped they would one day sit at a table with coffee and talk like men who had learned from the same hard teacher. When Dan's voice finally stopped, the quiet felt almost physical, like a soft blanket laid across a room that had been shivering. Jerry sat with his hands folded and breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth the way a person does when he wants to remember the shape of the moment. Dustin stared at the edge of the desk, jaw tight, eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with joy. He said there would be a challenge. He said there are always ways to challenge. Dan answered with the same unswerving courtesy that had carried the will into the light. He said safeguards existed, that the law respected the testator's choices, and that grief can be served more by acceptance than by courtroom strategies. Jerry turned to his son and said the words he had been practicing for a decade without knowing he was practicing them. He said he did not want to win. He wanted to do right by what had been entrusted. He said he would help where help was welcome and stand back where it was not. He said the door would remain open. The face across from him did not soften, but something about the eyes suggested the message had at least been delivered to the correct address. Dan folds the letter and sets it on the desk in front of Jerry, while Dustin whispers that this is not over. Silence filled the office after the letter, the kind that changes what a man believes about himself. The antique clock kept counting, each small tick landing like a reminder that the day still had hours left, that decisions would need to be made before the sun left the brick fronts on Main Street. Jerry sat very still and let the quiet do its work. He felt the way a field must feel after a long, hard wind, flattened in places and yet clearer for it, the view open all the way to the fence line. Across from him, Dustin stared at a spot on the desk, as if the wood might give back a different set of words. His anger had cooled to a thin heat, the kind that leaves a man tired. Dan waited without impatience, hands folded on the blue-backed folder, the letter resting near Jerry like a small and living thing. Dustin spoke first. He said there would be a challenge, then repeated it with less air in the words. He listed possibilities, the way a person recites routes even when the map shows only one road. Undue influence. Mental incapacity. Chain of custody. The legal phrases sounded practiced and also far away, like signals from a tower on a hill. Dan answered in the same steady register he had used all afternoon. He said the documents had been prepared with unusual care. He said an independent evaluation had been completed and preserved. He said that grief often looks for a door to push against, and the law was not that door today. Dustin nodded once, the motion sharp and small. He looked at Jerry and asked how a man who had chosen a quiet life expected to carry a company that had grown tall on ambition. Jerry did not rush an answer. He said some things grow by being tended rather than being driven, and that he planned to listen first and choose his steps after he knew whose feet had worn the path before him. Dan cleared his throat and moved them gently to the business of what came next. There would be filings and notices and a board session to seat a new chair. There would be meetings with the executive team, a review of standing contracts, a call with the outside accountants, and introductions to department heads who already kept the machine humming. Dan suggested a first gathering with employees, not a speech, more like an introduction, a chance to say a few simple truths and shake hands. Jerry agreed. He said he wanted it scheduled as soon as was respectful, and that he wished to hold it on company ground in a room where people felt at home, not in a rented hall that would make the day feel like a show. For a moment, Dustin's expression wavered. He asked whether he would be expected to attend a meeting where he had been demoted by a will. Jerry said no one had offered that word, and that he would not use it. He said Dustin had received the house and funds, and that the company still had roles for people who worked hard and learned in place. He said the door would remain open if Dustin wanted to build something that belonged to him without having to borrow weight from a title. Dustin laughed once, without humor, then stopped. He looked at the letter as if it might speak a second time. He said he did not know who he was without the straight line he thought he was walking. Jerry said that straight lines are useful for rulers and roads, and a life is more like water finding its way around stones. Dustin turned his face away and said that he needed time, not permission. Jerry said time is what he could offer. They stood, 3 men on the far side of a long day, and shook hands. Dustin's grip was cool and quick. Dan's was firm, the kind of handshake a person can steer by. Dan gathered the folder and slid it into a drawer, then opened another to remove a short list written in a neat hand. He read the items aloud. A call to the chief executive tomorrow morning. A notice to the board for a special session on Wednesday afternoon. Draft remarks for a brief employee introduction by Friday. Jerry listened and said yes where yes belonged. He asked Dan to add one more line. He wanted a meeting with the head of human resources and the head of community relations to talk about benefits, safety, and local partnerships. He said the company had done well by the town. He wanted to be sure the town felt that truth in ordinary ways, not only in newspaper stories. Dustin had moved to the window and was looking down at the street. The late light made the cars look like objects in a display case. He said that his mother had always believed impact could be measured and that she liked numbers that proved it. Jerry said numbers matter, and people matter first. He promised to learn the numbers well enough to earn the right to talk about the people. Dustin nodded slowly, then reached for his coat. He said he was going to the Hillrest house to walk the rooms, that he had not been there in a while without an event to plan. He paused at the door and looked back at Jerry with something like curiosity under all the other things. He asked if Jerry planned to move into an office with a view. Jerry said he would take the office the job required and spend time where the work lived, on floors where people knew each other's names. After Dustin left, the room felt larger in the way rooms do when a great many unspoken things have exited with a person. Dan slid the letter back into its envelope and placed it gently in Jerry's hands. Jerry did not pocket it. He held it the way a man holds a photograph he needs to keep in sight a little longer. He thanked Dan for his care, and Dan said care was the point of his work when it was done correctly. They talked through the first week again, not to change it, but to hear the shape of it one more time. Dan offered to walk Jerry through the building in the morning and to introduce him to a few people early, not with microphones, only names and handshakes. Jerry liked that. He said simple first steps make long walks possible. They left the office together and paused in the hallway as the last daylight leaned through the window at the stair landing. Dan said he would email a confirmation of the schedule, and Jerry smiled at the ordinary word email holding so much new life inside it. They went down the steps, past framed photos of civic events and ribbon cuttings, and out to the small porch that faced the street. The air smelled like it might rain and then changed its mind again, a Wyoming habit Jerry knew well. Dan said goodnight and turned toward the parking lot. Jerry stood for a moment at the top of the steps and let the evening rest on his shoulders. He walked slowly, not out of reluctance, but to give his thoughts time to catch up with his new responsibilities. He did not feel larger. He felt more anchored. He thought about the first words he would say to the employees. He wrote them in his head the way he had once written grocery lists on scraps of envelope. Thank you for the work you do. I am here to listen. We will lead with integrity. We will measure well-being as carefully as we measure profit. He thought about the boardroom and the break room and how both deserved sunlight. He promised himself to learn who answered the phones and who kept the copy machines running and who knew why a small process always stuck on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not plan a speech about transformation. He planned to ask for a tour and a stack of names to study on the bus ride home. He reached the sidewalk and felt hunger in a simple way, as if his body wished to remind him that days are still made of meals and cups and rest. Neon began to hum in the window of the diner down the block, a red line and a blue curve waking up for the night shift. A server wiped a counter with slow circles. Someone set a coffee mug by the far end and checked the level of the sugar jar. He thought about the first time he saw Brianna in a red coat, and how a good room can teach a person what courage sounds like. He thought about Dustin at a window just now, learning the shape of time without a plan to fill every inch of it. He hoped for a day when a table would hold 2 cups and conversation that did not lean on armor. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket and patted it once, a quiet, grateful habit. Then he stepped off the curb and into the crosswalk as the light changed. The town moved in its usual order around him, a car waiting, a dog on a leash pulling toward a tree, a couple deciding about pie. Jerry steps into the evening light, glances at the diner sign down the block, and turns toward it, ready to begin with a simple meal and a list of names to learn. He left the office in the early evening with the letter tucked close and the steady feeling that follows hard truth, not as a victor, but as a man entrusted. The town moved at its ordinary pace, and his steps were quiet, yet something in the air felt changed, as if the long hallway of years had opened a window at the far end. A son wrestled with pride and grief. A company waited for a gentler hand at the wheel, and the man everyone had underestimated chose responsibility over triumph. A simple meal over a loud toast, listening over display. In the hush after the storm, dignity sounded like soft shoes on a sidewalk and a careful promise to learn people's names before making plans for their work. From the beginning to the end, the thread was plain to see for anyone willing to trace it back through the rooms where vows were made and hopes were set aside, and at last, tempered love returned in a few pages of honest words. The lesson is not coded in bright colors. It is a quiet one that older hearts have known for a long time. Do not judge a life by the shine on its surface, because truth and justice often arrive from the place the world ignored. Hold your dignity when voices rise. Stand up for what is right with calm hands and a human spirit, not to score a victory, but to build something kind from what is broken. Like a porch light left on through a long night, one steady act of decency can guide a tired traveler to the right door. The man in this story did not chase power, yet it found him because character kept its shape when comfort fell away. He did not answer scorn with fire. He answered it with patience, with a willingness to serve, with a promise to measure well-being as carefully as profit. In a world that often confuses volume with value, that is a rare and durable strength. For anyone listening who has been dismissed at the table or spoken over at the meeting or treated as smaller than the truth, let this be a simple encouragement. The heart that keeps faith with the work in front of it is never truly small. The years have a way of revealing what manners and mirrors cannot. When the day comes to choose between display and duty, choose duty and let the results speak in their own time. A son may still need distance. A town may still be slow to understand. But steady care turns, little by little, into trust. And trust turns into the kind of justice that does not need applause. Take a quiet moment to think about what part of this story touched your own days, and where patience, mercy, or courage could change the shape of a room you know well. If this story stirred something in you, consider passing a bit of that warmth to someone who could use it, the way a porch light helps a neighbor find the steps when the night is deep.